World War II is often remembered as a battle between good and evil, heroes and villains, victory and defeat. But beneath the familiar story lies a much darker truth, one that history rarely shows in full. Behind the headlines of bravery and liberation were secrets, moral compromises, and unimaginable human suffering on all sides. Entire cities were erased, civilians became targets, and decisions were made that still haunt humanity today. This was not just a war of nations. It was a war of survival, fear, and power. And the deeper you look, the more unsettling the truth becomes. World War II began in 1939, when Adolf Hitler launched an invasion of Poland, triggering a global conflict that would involve more than 30 countries. On one side stood the Axis powers, primarily Germany, Italy, and Japan, driven by expansion, ideology, and control. On the other side were the Allies, including Britain, the Soviet Union, and eventually the United States, fighting to stop that expansion and restore balance. But the reality of this war was far more complex than a simple fight between right and wrong. Governments on all sides made ruthless decisions in the name of victory. Strategic bombing campaigns by Allied forces destroyed entire cities like Dresden and Tokyo, killing hundreds of thousands of civilians. Meanwhile, Nazi Germany carried out the Holocaust, a systematic genocide that led to the murder of 6 million Jews, along with millions of others deemed undesirable. In the Pacific, Imperial Japan committed brutal acts across Asia, including the Nanjing Massacre, where countless civilians were killed in horrific ways. At the same time, the United States made the controversial decision to drop atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, an act that ended the war but introduced a terrifying new era of warfare. This was a world consumed by fear, propaganda, and survival instincts. Leaders justified extreme actions, soldiers followed orders under unimaginable pressure, and civilians paid the highest price. The dark truth of World War II is that it was not just a story of heroes defeating villains. It was a global tragedy where morality was often blurred and humanity itself was tested to its limits. At the heart of World War II was not just a clash of armies, but a brutal struggle between ideologies, ambitions, and survival itself. What made this conflict so devastating was how it consumed entire nations, turning civilians into targets, cities into battlegrounds, and morality into a weapon that could be bent or broken depending on who held power. Adolf Hitler envisioned a vast German empire that would dominate Europe for generations. His ideology was rooted in racial superiority, expansion, and absolute control. This vision drove Germany's aggressive military campaigns, known as Blitzkrieg, which allowed them to rapidly conquer Poland, France, and much of Europe in a short time. To many, it seemed unstoppable. But behind these victories was a darker mission, the systematic extermination of millions in concentration camps, a crime so vast it would later be known as the Holocaust. Opposing him was a fragile and divided alliance. Leaders like Winston Churchill and Franklin D. Roosevelt understood that stopping Hitler was not just about territory. It was about preventing a world ruled by tyranny. Yet even within the Allied forces, there were deep tensions. The Soviet Union, led by Joseph Stalin, was both an ally and a source of fear. Stalin's regime was ruthless, and his priorities often conflicted with those of Britain and the United States. This uneasy alliance was held together not by trust, but by necessity. The conflict quickly expanded beyond Europe. In Asia, Imperial Japan sought to build its own empire, attacking territories across China and Southeast Asia. The situation escalated dramatically when Japan launched a surprise attack on Pearl Harbor in 1941, bringing the United States fully into the war. Overnight, what had been a regional conflict became a truly global war, stretching across continents and oceans. As the war intensified, the lines between military and civilian targets began to disappear. Strategic bombing campaigns became a central tactic. Cities like London, Berlin, and Tokyo were relentlessly bombed, with the goal of breaking enemy morale. But these bombings often resulted in massive civilian casualties. Entire neighborhoods were reduced to rubble, and countless innocent lives were lost in the process. The idea of total war meant that everyone, whether soldier or civilian, became part of the conflict. On the Eastern Front, the war reached a level of brutality rarely seen in history. The clash between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union was not just about land. It was a war of annihilation. Millions of soldiers died in horrific conditions, and prisoners of war were often left to starve or executed. The Battle of Stalingrad became a turning point, symbolizing both the resilience of the Soviet people and the beginning of Germany's decline. But victory came at an unimaginable cost, with entire cities destroyed and countless lives lost. Meanwhile, in Nazi-occupied territories, resistance movements began to rise. Ordinary citizens risked their lives to fight back against oppression, sabotaging enemy operations and providing intelligence to allies. These acts of courage showed that even in the darkest times, the human spirit could resist. But the consequences were severe. Entire villages were punished, and innocent people were executed in retaliation. In the Pacific, the war took on a different, but equally brutal character. Fighting was often close range, intense, and unforgiving. Soldiers faced harsh jungle conditions, limited supplies, and an enemy that refused to surrender. Battles like Iwo Jima and Okinawa demonstrated the extreme lengths both sides were willing to go to achieve victory. Civilians in these regions were also caught in the crossfire, facing violence, displacement, and starvation. As the war dragged on, desperation grew. Both sides saw any advantage they could find, leading to rapid advancements in technology and warfare. Radar, code-breaking, and new weapons changed how battles were fought. But the most terrifying development came with the creation of the atomic bomb. This weapon had the power to destroy entire cities in seconds, and its existence marked a turning point not just in the war, but in human history. The decision to use atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki remains one of the most controversial aspects of the war. On one hand, it brought a swift end to the conflict in the Pacific. On the other, it caused immense destruction and loss of life, raising profound ethical questions that continue to be debated today. It was a moment that highlighted the ultimate contradiction of the war, ending one horror by unleashing another. Throughout the conflict, propaganda played a powerful role. Governments controlled information, shaping how people viewed the war and their enemies. Citizens were encouraged to see the conflict in simple terms, good versus evil, while the reality was far more complex. Fear, anger, and nationalism were used to unify populations, but they also deepened divisions and justified extreme actions. At its core, the main conflict of World War II was not just about winning battles or gaining territory. It was about the survival of nations, the clash of opposing worldviews, and the limits of human morality under extreme pressure. Every decision carried consequences, and every victory came with a cost. What makes this conflict truly dark is that there were no easy answers, no clean victories. Even as the Allies moved closer to winning the war, the destruction they left behind raised difficult questions about justice, responsibility, and the true price of peace. The world that emerged after World War II was forever changed, shaped by both the triumphs and the tragedies of those years. The main conflict of World War II reveals a powerful and unsettling truth. When the stakes are high enough, humanity is capable of both extraordinary courage and unimaginable cruelty. And it is in that tension between light and darkness that the true story of the war is found. When World War II finally ended in 1945, the world was left scarred, exhausted, and forever changed. The devastation was unimaginable. Entire cities lay in ruins, millions of soldiers and civilians had perished, and economies were shattered. Europe, once the center of global power, faced the enormous task of rebuilding amidst the wreckage of war. Germany was divided, its cities bombed, its population traumatized, and its leadership prosecuted for crimes against humanity in the Nuremberg trials. The Holocaust had left an indelible mark on humanity, exposing the horrific consequences of unchecked hatred and ideology. In Asia, Japan faced a similar reckoning. The atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki ended the Pacific conflict but caused unprecedented civilian casualties. Japan's surrender marked the end of its empire, and the nation was occupied and reconstructed under Allied supervision, laying the groundwork for its post-war democracy and economic revival. The war also reshaped global power structures. The United States and the Soviet Union emerged as superpowers, beginning a tense rivalry that would define the Cold War for decades. Former colonial powers weakened by the conflict struggled to maintain control over their overseas territories, fueling independence movements across Asia and Africa. Societies everywhere were forced to confront the human cost of total war. Civilians had endured bombings, famine, forced labor, and displacement. Refugees roamed Europe and Asia, seeking shelter and survival. International institutions like the United Nations were created to prevent future conflicts, emphasizing diplomacy and cooperation over conquest. Ultimately, the aftermath of World War II was both a warning and a lesson. The pursuit of power and ideology at the expense of humanity leads to catastrophic consequences. Yet from the ruins, nations began rebuilding, alliances were forged, and a commitment to human rights emerged, a fragile but determined hope that the horrors of the past would not be repeated.